parliamentary leader.
I'd like to thank my predecessor, John Hewson, for all he has done over the last 4 years.
I intend to fight on for what I believe in, and I intend to do that by giving Alexander Down and his new team my 100% support and loyalty.
Despite the rhetoric of unity, the defeated leader was soon sacked from the shadow cabinet.
I have played it straight.
John Hewson has been a member of the team, but he has not played the team game.
My message to Mr Downer is very clear. Mr Downer, you will not heal the wounds of the Liberal Party by turning the knife.
The issue of loyalty plagues the Liberals. The last time the Federal Party managed an entirely happy leadership change was when Robert Menzies handed over to his deputy, Harold Holt, back in 1966.
I confidently believe that our best years are ahead of us, and not behind us, proud though we may be.
But the years ahead would be complicated by war in Vietnam.
That you have an admiring friend, a staunch friend, that will be all the way with LBJ.
The Federal Liberal Party became accident-prone. One leader was lost, another destroyed by chronic infighting. Finally, the party cascaded to electoral defeat, as the habits of disunity were learnt.
Critics of the stomp say it is weird, undignified, more like a corrobboree than a conventional dance, and the stomp is in trouble. At least 2 municipal councils, one in Sydney, the other in South Australia, have put their foot down.
The Menzies post-war years had delivered national prosperity and a self-confident Liberal government. Late in '66, the party went to the polls, fighting the election over the Vietnam involvement.
The Australian... He can't possibly talk again. I'm indebted to a gentleman here this morning who informs me he was talking to a young man whose brother was killed in Vietnam. The vital issues which affect the future security of this country. The Right Honourable Harold Holt.
It was the Liberals' biggest ever win. Harold Holt won a 41-seat majority. Yet even in his time of triumph, the Prime Minister felt the heat of his new job.
Harold didn't like the idea of young Australians going to war. The whole thing was just so against his nature. But nevertheless, he believed it was right, and therefore believed that it was his duty as Prime Minister to defend that sort of decision. And I think it took a great deal out of him, probably.
He was a decent man, and that inspired people to go after him and to follow him and to do what he wanted. That's why I feel angry at the unspeakable bastards who were plotting his defeat at the time of his death. They've got a lot to answer for, those people.
Holt's massive majority hid flaws in the Liberal fabric. It had taken a Menzies to manage some of the personalities in the coalition. Deputy Liberal leader William McMahon, for one, was a man who made friends and enemies. His great friend and supporter was Frank Packer, owner of the Sydney Telegraph.
I think that our press, that I'm talking about the Telegraph in those days, exerted a tremendous political influence. And of course, our views were very strictly conservative.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. McEwen.
McMahon's enemy was Deputy Prime Minister John McEwen, leader of the Country Party.
Thank you, Mr. Tunney.
They were a bit like, water and oil. They just didn't mix very well. But I think over a period of time, McMahon probably told stories to the media with a slant that annoyed John McEwen. I think that's where the dislike developed.
Then there were the younger men with ambition. Malcolm Fraser had spent 10 years on the backbench under Menzies.
I said to Harold at the time, no sour grapes, but I don't want to be a private member of Parliament all my life. And if the leader of the party is not going to regard me as ministerial material at some stage, I'll be very happy to step down and make way in Wannon for somebody else who may be ministerial material.
I don't know how ambitious Malcolm was for himself at that time, but he revealed very strong ambitions later on, so I must assume they didn't just suddenly come to him.
Harold Holt duly made Malcolm Fraser Army Minister. Fraser served next to other Liberal prospects, Billy Snedden, Don Chipp, and 27-year-old Andrew Peacock. The sea-loving Harold Holt began to look quite different from Menzies, and the party began to find a new course.
We are going, we are going, we are going to freedom.
We want to become a part of our country.
In 1967, the government ended constitutional discrimination against Aborigines, backing a national referendum. Racism was also addressed when Holt finished off the White Australia immigration policy. But Holt had his problems.
The Voyager and the aircraft carrier were performing a manoeuvre known as turning together. A Royal Commission later found that unaccountably the destroyer had made a tighter turn than ordered.
The drama of the Voyager accident was still running, with questions about secrecy, compensation, and a second Royal Commission. By 1967, there was also a growing controversy about the use of government VIP planes.
Harold Holt's grip on the game seemed to be loosening. I will never forget a moment in the House when Harold produced a letter supporting what the government was doing. And he read the letter, took him about a minute to read the letter, and finally Whitlam interjected, I think it was Whitlam, and said, "Who signed it?" And there's tense silence in the House. And Harold said, "It's not signed." Now, I don't think I've ever experienced a moment in the House of Representatives like there was in that next few seconds. Our troops were just aghast. There was uproar on the Labor benches. Now, it was a silly thing to do, but that wasn't the point. The point was that we knew we had a leader who would do something quite stupid.
He was being undermined all the time by McMahon, who was working around amongst members to try and get rid of him. Oh yes, didn't you know that?
I last saw Harold Holt in Canberra, talked to him, and I remember his words saying, you know, Len, man wasn't made to live like this.
At the end of 1967, Holt retreated for the weekend to Portsea. He carried a letter from the party whip, which expressed concern over the government's performance.
My own feeling about what happened is something like this. He was a very good swimmer, a very good snorkeler, and he came back to Melbourne and troubled, not very well, overstretched, overstrained, worried, I believe, at the ascendancy which Whitlam was beginning to gain, and thinking, well, now I can relax. There's one area in which I really am unchallenged boss, and that's the sea. And I think in that sort of frame of mind, he went to the element where he felt liberated and misjudged the kindness with which his favourite element would receive him on that fatal day.
The search today was hampered by rain, strong winds and vicious seas. Since early this morning, the weather has been completely unpredictable.
The complicating factor in this whole tragedy is
But due to the fact that no trace has been found of Mr. Holt, world leaders who are anxious to pay tribute to the Australian Prime Minister feel it injudicious to do so while...
One senior Liberal cried over the phone, said, "Chippy, I don't think I can ever get over this." Another one expressed concern that I'd loved this man ever since I was a boy. And I was so naive at the time, I thought their concern, their grief was genuine. But of course, in politics, it's such a hideous game that as soon as one leader dies, there's not grief or sympathy that is evoked in the breasts of many. It is suddenly a wish to be leader. The thought that, well, I can take his place. Now, these people were ringing me not to express their grief, but it was to sound me out about their chances and how they'd operate as a candidate.
First, I want now publicly to express through your media my deep regret at the loss of Mr. Holt.
John McEwen was sworn in as Prime Minister, but as Country Party leader, he could not hold the office permanently. However, he had a blunt message for the Liberals.
That I have told Mr. McMahon that neither I nor my Country Party colleagues would be prepared to serve under him as Prime Minister.
He didn't trust him, and he might as well settle the issue once and for all. And so he just said that he would not work under McMahon.
McMahon was completely obsessed with and incensed with what had happened. He just couldn't believe it. But the answer was the party believes John McEwen when he said this, and there's not much you can do about it.
This left the field open. Paul Hasluck was persuaded to stand by old hands, including Menzies. The second main candidate was Senate leader John Gorton. Harold Holt's body was never found. The positioning for the inheritance went on over several days.
At Harold Holt's memorial service, there was as much talk and lobbying for leadership positions at that as there were tributes being paid, and that was sickening. It was one of the most sickening public services I've ever been to.
His term of office as Prime Minister has been all too short. It is impossible for us to calculate now what the loss of Mr. Holt will mean to Australia at this juncture in our history.
There was some lobbying going on because I was doing some.
An organised corps lobbied hard for Gorton, amongst them Junior Minister Malcolm Fraser.
I did much less, I think, in that contest than I was sometimes, than some people sometimes suggested. But I did vote for John Gorton.
Malcolm was genuinely very strong. Well, Malcolm was very strong for Gorton, and I have no recall of anything other than Malcolm believing that John Gorton would make an excellent Prime Minister.
John Gorton, however, had enemies. Victorian Liberal Premier of 12 years, Henry Bolte, fired the first shots in a long campaign of state Liberals against Gorton.
Well, it was the Sunday that Harold Holt went missing. The Boltes were coming to lunch the next day. Henry had obviously had several whiskies on the way, and we had to have the television on all the time. He looked at the television, he used the telephone, he then had a drink, He then went into the pool, and we were afraid he might drown because we've always been told you shouldn't swim if you've had a lot to drink. But he was so livid because he had phone calls on the Sunday night that Gorton was going to get up as the leader. And I think that dislike of Gorton continued all his life.
The Liberal Party took only 20 minutes to vote in Senator Gorton as the new leader.
A fighter pilot whose face had been reconstructed after a wartime accident, Gorton set off a swell of popular support. He had a casual charm and a touch of the larrikin. He was a very different Liberal from Menzies.
Don't forget, Menzies was born in the 1800s or something, and he'd been going up with the King and the Queen. He didn't have a feeling so much for an Australian nation. And I did have a feeling of Australia as a nation.
He was calling forth a national spirit in people that the pockets of parochialism in Australia find hard to accept.
Of course, these new ideas didn't go down well with the troglodytes in the party, the arch-conservatives.
Well, look, first of all, I belong to a Liberal party, not a Conservative party.
But in truth, a Conservative party.
Well, I think it's a Liberal party. At any rate, I'm a Liberal. And
I began to have significant reservations about John Gorton as Prime Minister, almost as soon as he became Prime Minister. Some of John Gorton's early interviews, I think, made the point that if he felt strongly enough about an issue, he ought to be able to get his own way, regardless of what his cabinet felt. That made me uneasy.
Gorton was an economic interventionist who favoured schemes like industry development. He clashed with the more free market approach of McMahon and Treasury.
I tried to get the Liberal Party to take new approaches in the fields of social services and Commonwealth-state relations and overseas investment, and retaining Australian equity and Australian ownership of assets and things of that kind. All these raised some kind of opposition from somewhere and caused some controversy all the time.
By the end of 1969, Conservative premiers like Robert Askin of New South Wales ruled in every state. But national unity eluded John Gorton. Above all, Vietnam split the community. Even the Prime Minister himself had no great enthusiasm for the war.
In fact, I thought it was a nuisance, really. But we were engaged in it. It was strongly held by the Liberal Party that we should be in it. And I wasn't going to say, well, we shouldn't be in it.
Gorton's lukewarm commitment pleased no one, least of all Conservatives who wanted a more hawkish defence policy.
One of the biggest arguments I had with Gorton was in 1969, where it was essential that we have the DLP preferences. And after discussions with the DLP, they were very concerned in regard to the defence of Australia. And they particularly wanted a naval base at Coburn Sound in Western Australia, which many of us wanted. It was terribly important that something of that nature was done. And I spoke to Gorton about it, and he said, oh no, forget it. He said, I don't want to have to do anything like that. So I told him straight out, I said, okay, well, you lose the election. You either do that, or you're not going to get DLP preferences. And fortunately, he agreed to do it.
With the country split over defence and conscription, John Gorton went to the polls. His majority was reduced from 38 to 7.
There is some dissatisfaction. It is shown by the vote, and it is necessary for that to be identified
and rectified.
Within days, a cabinet minister resigned and Gorton was challenged for the leadership by William McMahon.
Yes. Gentlemen, I can advise you that on the first ballot, the Prime Minister, John Gorton, has been elected leader of the Liberal Party.
Well, I can only say that I am not of or in the establishment.
So your forces probably will not change, you don't feel?
Oh, I think they might, but I think, as I've indicated, they would need to. But I think it's unlikely that they would change in a conservative direction.
John Gorton has been elected the leader of the Liberal Party. We in the party have given our unqualified allegiance to him as the leader. And there are no divisions in our party itself.
To the dismay of supporters like Frank Packer, McMahon was demoted from Treasury.
I couldn't describe Bill McMahon's role in Gorton's downfall in any coherent, connected, analytical fashion, because that's not the way Bill McMahon worked. It was rather hole in corner. It was a smile here and a nod there and a wink there. But he was a very, very destructive politician so far as the stability of the leadership went.
As I moved in business circles in Sydney, I'd be asked questions. Wasn't Gorton financially unsound? Thoughts that had been planted in the business community by Billy.
Gorton's battle with the Conservatives only intensified. He signalled that he wanted to take the states to the High Court over ownership of Australia's offshore seabed.
It has been referred to as an attempt to take the benefits of mineral deposits on the seabed away from the states. It isn't. It's been described as an attempt to take away states' legal rights. It isn't. It is purely and simply an attempt to discover, by the only means known to me, who is legally responsible for the control of the seas around Australia. We are the only nation which does not know what the legal position is and where sovereignty lies. And it can surely not be claimed to be an act of centralism to seek to discover this.
The fabric of the Liberal Party had been challenged, and the question of the federal nature of the party, because John Gorton had demonstrated that he'd become a most centralist Prime Minister, or certainly a very centralist Prime Minister for a Liberal.
Gorton was a man who really didn't have the same ideas and principles and standards as the Liberal Party. And I often wondered really how he happened to get into the Liberal Party.
Gorton also upset Conservatives with his social style. There was media comment about Ainsley Gotto, his young private secretary, and incidents like the night he disappeared backstage after a concert by Liza Minnelli.
In her dressing room was the most innocent scene I've ever seen. Gorton was relaxed in a chair with his feet up on a desk. Liza was at the far end and she just finished changing. Her dresser was there. I think her manager was there. They'd all been indulging in great jokes and hilarity and so on. And of course, the press made it almost into that he'd gone into sort of make a pass at unfortunate Liza Minnelli.
And then the matters that were in the press at the time all added up to an untidy situation that I believed was causing concern amongst the whole electorate.
I really feel that this man is unfit to be the Prime Minister.
For what reasons?
Well, for a great variety of reasons. many of which I think would be evident from what one has read in the press over the last year. But may I mention the kind of thing that I'm concerned with? I'm concerned with his personal conduct, as you know from what I said in the House last night. But I'm also concerned with a great range of tendencies and attitudes and particular decisions.
OK, he had a drink now and again when maybe it would have been wiser for him not to have done so. Maybe he spoke in a friendly way to a pretty girl when, although meaning no mischief, it might have been better to have done that in private rather than on a public dance floor. But to hell with it, I mean. That was John Gorton. That was the wonderful part about the man. What you saw is what you got.
It is about 2 years now my people have been struggling along on this problem. And when will the government of Australia listen? What them? Papua New Guinea being like a football ground for the Liberal Party of Australia.
In July 1970, civil unrest erupted in Papua New Guinea, an Australian territory. Gorton reinforced his headstrong reputation when he decided to put troops on alert to assist local police.
I had previously asked the Minister for Defence to get the same order from the Governor-General, but he had queried it and said no, he couldn't do that because something called a Defence Committee, I don't know who they are, but had raised questions about it. And so I went to see the Governor-General and to get quickly the people ready there. The Governor-General refused.
I had advised the Governor-General that there had not been a cabinet meeting on the issue, and that's why my signature wasn't on the paper.
The Attorney-General, Tom Hughes, agreed with Fraser and persuaded Gorton to hold a cabinet meeting to discuss and approve the call-out. Yet the event had entirely different implications for these two senior cabinet ministers.
But this is an example of due process, or the lack of it. And if you follow due process, you have safeguards that your political system is not going to be distorted or twisted in ways that could have extraordinarily serious consequences.
Here was an example of a Prime Minister, certainly a strong-minded Prime Minister, who was anxious to get his way, but who was persuaded by the ordinary processes of reasoned debate to change his view. And I would have thought that's what part of what cabinet government is all about.
I believe he saw himself as a transitional Prime Minister. There were a number of younger leaders in the Liberal Party, all not sufficiently mature to command support at that time, but during the years that John Gorton would have been and should have been Prime Minister, it would have shaken itself out, and the leader would have emerged and been the future Prime Minister.
The problems I was finding within Canberra and within my own area of responsibility were in many ways being repeated across the spectrum of government and the spectrum of the party. And it was all of that that led to John Gorton's undoing. Something was bound to be the last straw.
The Vietnam War had dominated much of 60s politics. It was fitting that it should become the subject of a week of confusion and suspicion in the government. A week that was the last straw for John Gorton. Defence Minister Fraser was a true believer on Vietnam, but he distrusted the idea of a purely military solution. He supported a scheme the army had started to provide aid to South Vietnamese peasants.
I had an idealistic view that it would be much best if when Australian soldiers left, Vietnamese memory of those soldiers was undertaking what we call civic action tasks.
Fraser remained more enthusiastic about civic aid than the army. In February 1971, he began unattributed briefings to journalists on these differences.
So I went along to see him, and out came all this other stuff in terms of what was happening in Vietnam, and clearly what was his distrust of the military intelligence or the military attitude to what Australia's role in Vietnam was.
Alan Ramsay's piece in the Sunday Australian newspaper suggested a rift between the government and the military. A story then circulated that the army was pulling out of civic aid altogether. Fraser let more journalists know of his displeasure. John Gorton was then approached for comment by a reporter from the Packer stable. Soon after, the Prime Minister called Army Chief General Tom Daly to his office.
And John Gorton said to me, I don't even know whether the rumours are correct, but he said they are emanating from the press gallery. That selected journalists are being briefed by somebody in the Defence Department. I mentioned the article in the Sunday Australian the previous day by Alan Ramsay, and he said, well, if these attacks continue, I want you to know that the army and its leaders have my fullest support, and I will come out, I think he said, take them on, head on, something of that, on those lines. No, he didn't say, I will defend the army against Malcolm Fraser, because Malcolm Fraser's name hadn't come into it.
But I was Defence Minister, and I thought it was a matter I should handle. And I was, until other people got involved. And I suppose, quite specifically, until the Prime Minister called General Daly to his office and spoke to him about it.
The Daly meeting became critical to John Gorton's whole future. How it came to public notice is still a mystery. Gorton says he told no one about it. General Daly says he told the Secretary of the Army, Bruce White, and sometime later, Army Minister Andrew Peacock.
They're the only people I spoke to about it.
At the time, Andrew Peacock was Junior Minister to Fraser and was responsible for the Army. During the week, Peacock had been hospitalised with acute sinus pain.
Yeah, it's always possible, as you know, and I've learned over the years, that if one person tells another person, that generally means that the conversation is going to be conveyed to 3 or 4 others. Not many more than that, but 3 or 4 others, but then those 3 or 4 are going to convey it on. So you could assume that if White and I were the two who were told, that we would tell 3 or 4 people. In fact, I wouldn't have been able to unless it was some itinerant sister or nurse in a hospital. I was unable. I mean, there were only a couple of people allowed to call me. I wasn't in a position to.
However the story got out, journalist Alan Ramsay heard a version of what General Daly had said.
I'd been told that his concern was that Fraser was being disloyal to the military and to Andrew Peacock, who was then Minister for the Army, and was using this issue in political terms to politically disadvantage Peacock in terms of himself. That's essentially was the story.
Well, gentlemen of the press, I understand you have a predilection for press conferences, and now for the next 30 minutes I'm in your hands while we have one.
Gorton's press relations had become strained, but Alan Ramsay knew him well. Ramsay decided to send Gorton a précis of his potential scoop and to check it with the Prime Minister himself.
So that when I walked into Gorton's office that day on the Wednesday afternoon, John Gorton was sitting behind his desk and he's got this piece of paper in front of him.
There were about 5 or 6 points, and I looked at a couple of them, and then I said, oh, no, because at that stage, Fraser and I were getting ready for an attack on Fraser in Parliament. And I said, oh, I'd better leave this. I'll answer these questions like this when this debate comes on in Parliament. And he said, fair enough.
Absolute and utter bullshit. Absolute and utter bullshit. He reads the précis out loud to me. And then he goes through the questions and he says, right, you ask, and he read off the question and he answered it. I had no doubt in the world. He was prepared to tell me what he'd said in their discussion about what they talked about, but he wouldn't tell me in detail what Daly had said. But nothing that he said in that discussion between us in any way conflicted with my resume of the story. Nothing.
Well, it's his belief, but I don't believe it is true. If you don't answer anything that a journalist asks you, is that to be taken as giving that journalist the right to publish the original things?
Alan Ramsay ran the story on Thursday. It did not look good for Fraser. It said that General Daly had accused Fraser of disloyalty and of political point scoring against Andrew Peacock.
Now, this is absolute rubbish, complete nonsense. In my interview with the Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser's name did not come up, nor did Andrew Peacock's.
I think there were people around John Gorton at that time who thought that Malcolm Fraser was getting too big for his boots and needed cutting down to size. And it may well be that it was felt that an article of the kind that Alan Ramsay was handling might contribute to that. I think that what they had in mind was some sort of controlled burning off exercise, which unfortunately became a bushfire.
Are you aware of continuing reports that you briefed the people who in fact began this controversy, Mr. Fraser? Have you any comment?
Fraser and Gorton were by now mired in mutual suspicion.
I would never have allowed a report like that to be made about one of my ministers. I really wouldn't. If I'd had those sorts of views of a minister, I would have asked him for his ticket and said, look, I don't want you in my team anymore. But I wouldn't allow a journalist, knowingly, to write a report that's going to be highly damaging.
The way in which he briefed and answered questions and things like that, well, I think that he behaved very circumspectly, is about the best way that I can put it. After all, he's still alive, and I know that the laws of libel apply to people who are still alive, and so he behaved very circumspectly.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
On Sunday night, Packer journalist Alan Reid suggested on television that if Fraser resigned, he would bring down John Gorton.
I'd rang Malcolm up and said, did you hear that awful stuff that they put over the meeting? And he said, no, it's all right, you go to bed, boss, and don't worry about it. And so I went to bed, and next morning I had to worry about it, because he resigned.
But if I'd made up my mind that I wanted to resign, I obviously didn't want to be sacked before I resigned. And I think that's legitimate. And I wasn't going to give any warning to John Gorton that night of what I'd intended. I wanted to do it when I could have it out clear as my decision, my option.
On the Monday, Fraser did resign his cabinet post.
The day I made my resignation speech, I asked two people into my office, and I had a speech written out. And I suppose this only indicates the turmoil in my own mind, because I'd never envisaged that I'd be in that position. And I asked both of them, they didn't have time to read the speech, but I said, I've got a speech here that I think will probably destroy John Gorton's prime ministership. Should I make it or should I not make it? And they both said I should make it.
Since his election to office, the Prime Minister has seriously damaged the Liberal Party and cast aside the stability and sense of direction of earlier times. The Prime Minister, because of his unreasoned drive to get his own way, his obstinacy, impetuous and emotional reactions, has imposed strains upon the Liberal Party, the government and the public service. I do not believe he is fit to hold the great office of Prime Minister, and I cannot serve in his government.
I thought it was manifestly unfair to Gorton. I thought it was unnecessarily brutal. It was one of the most savage speeches I ever heard. Obviously, it was a speech that a great deal of attention had been given to it, but it was absolutely rugged in every respect.
The speech was part and parcel of a fabric which led to John Gorton's downfall. And that was, in my opinion, a very sad day for the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party, perhaps, has never quite recovered from those events.
It's been a day of high drama in Canberra.
Fraser's speech was the trigger for a vote of confidence in Gorton next day.
But the political crisis remains unresolved.
Gorton's enemies were organising. Liberal state premiers let it be known they wanted a change. Opponents like Peter Howson began canvassing for McMahon.
A number of us had been counting the numbers beforehand, and I thought that we had the numbers at the time.
Oh, there was bitterness not just in the way he was going, but there was bitterness abounding before he went. There was bitterness at the unrelenting struggle by people to remove John Gorton.
Andrew Peacock, Tom Hughes, myself, Jim Killen, Gorton's loyal supporters, were out among the traps the night before, making sure he had the numbers. And we came back and said, there's no worry, he's home and hosed. What we didn't know was that there's a lot of two-headed creatures in that Liberal Party at that time who were telling us they'd vote for Gorton, but in the secrecy of the ballot, they'd vote no. That day in March 1971, when the party meeting was held to determine who's going to be leader, whether John Gorton would continue or not, is something like you can never forget it. I know exactly where I was sitting in the party room. I know who's sitting each side of me. It's almost as if it's yesterday.
It was one of the most moving experiences I've ever had in my life. Speech after speech was made at the party room, attacking him. It was unrelenting. He refused to allow me to speak, and the third time when I went to him asking him to allow me to speak, I tell you, my eyes were wet.
It was almost as if fate was directing the hands of the scrutineers when they put their hand into the ballot box to bring one out, as if they said, bring a Gorton one out, bring an anti-Gorton one out, because the piles grew exactly at the same rate. And finally the scrutineer said to the Prime Minister, John Gorton, the result is a tie, 33 all.
Gorton made his casting vote against himself.
If I hadn't voted against myself, it was clear that half the party weren't prepared to follow me.
With the persistence of the stupid, the Liberal Party then proceeded with the next ballot, which was who was to be leader.
William McMahon, Australia's new Prime Minister. This is Ross Simons in Sydney with a national news report to all 6 states of the Commonwealth. This afternoon, the Governor-General commissioned Mr McMahon to form a government after a meeting of the Parliamentary Liberal Party decided on a change of leadership. The Minister...
I don't really believe that whoever started this hair running, well, it was Malcolm Fraser, of course. I don't really believe that he could have anticipated the results of it. For instance, all those articles in the press, they were in effect a powder train running into the cabinet room to a barrel of gunpowder in there, and in due course it blew up.
I think they destroyed the Liberal succession and Liberal government in Australia.
In some ways, clearly, people were very annoyed and bitter at what I'd done. In other ways, there were some people who believed that I stood for a principle, and maybe from that time regarded me as a future leader for the first time.
There are many implications that come from the events of today and yesterday that I'd like to draw you on.
Well, I'm sure there are, but I'm not going to be drawn.
When will you allow us to draw you?
The past is past. We are looking to the future, and we are going to win the 1972 elections.
Can I ask you personal questions about how you feel and that sort of thing?
I feel like I want a good sleep.
Malcolm Fraser retired to the backbench. It would be a while yet before he would be forgiven his public execution of an incumbent Liberal Prime Minister.
I never took any action to do anything else than to treat Mr. Gorton as the leader of the government and to give him undivided loyalty.
So, what is your relationship now with the Prime Minister, Mr. McMahon?
Why, we're polite to each other.
John Gorton had been elected deputy to McMahon. It wouldn't last. Within 6 months they fell out again and Gorton resigned. William McMahon was finally Prime Minister at 63, the first Liberal Prime Minister who hadn't come from Victoria.
The first time Bill and I went to Melbourne after he became leader and Prime Minister, there was a Liberal Party meeting that we went to, and during the course of the evening, one of the women in the, I think she was in the executive, but certainly one of the leading lights, told Bill in no uncertain terms that they wouldn't tolerate a Prime Minister from New South Wales, that he would only be an interim Prime Minister.
People tended to see him as some little bald-headed gnome with big ears, just rushing around like a blowfly, you know. And they couldn't see that underneath there was a man with a purpose, with an enormous amount of energy.
Well, one of the things I remember working with Bill McMahon is we'd race everywhere in these huge black Commonwealth cars. Car would stop, he'd leap out and shake hands with the nearest person. 2 or 3 times a day, that person was his bodyguard.
He became so conscious of trying to ring everybody up to find their points of view that by the time he'd gone round and round the subject, he had forgotten what his real original viewpoint had been. And often it was the last person whom he rang who decided the issue. You never knew who was going to be the last person.
Morale went from bad to worse. McMahon's old enemy, John McEwen, had retired, but McMahon fell out with a new Country Party leader, Doug Anthony, when he decided to revalue the dollar without consulting him.
To be told that that's what we're going to do was no way to treat a coalition partner, least of all me. I mean, I don't like being taken for granted, and I can be as compromising and as understanding as anybody. But McMahon, for some silly reason, took this attitude with me that he was the Prime Minister and this is what had to be done.
Then, in a body blow to McMahon, Frank Packer sold the Sydney Daily Telegraph to Rupert Murdoch, then a Labor supporter.
When Frank sold the Telegraph, he asked us up to his house, which is just up the road, when Rupert Murdoch was there, and they were actually signing the deal. Frank made Bill and Rupert shake hands, and Rupert guaranteed that he would correct any statements and etc. that were incorrect, and he gave a couple of guarantees, which of course never happened. Yes, Bill knew that was disaster as far as the election was concerned.
When you pray, do you pray for things, in fact?
Yes, I do.
Would you pray for something like victory in an election?
Yes.
Well, I'd sort of lost favour with Bill McMahon because Bill Snedden and I decided we ought to have an election on the budget in 1972 rather than an election with the competing forces of McMahon and Whitlam. When we explained this to Bill McMahon, he was absolutely horrified to think that we thought he couldn't beat Whitlam. And he didn't want to talk to me after that. I really wasn't a friend if I thought so little of him. So when I went to ask him about when we were going to have the election, he just said categorically to me, "I'm not going to tell you." Oh, I was a bit taken back. And he went on to say that only 3 people know about it. And I'm not going to tell you who they are. And I thought, well, this is petty and no use talking to the man anymore. So I walked out. But I thought, now who could those 3 people be? Obviously one would be Sonia, his wife, and he had a young daughter, so I gave her the credit of being number 2. But who would the 3rd person be? And I thought, it'll be Jack Marshall, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. There was a custom back in those days for the 2 coalition parties to try to have elections on the same day. So I rang Jack Marshall up, who was a good friend of mine, and I said, "Jack, when are you having your election?" He said, "Oh, Doug, the same day as you're having yours." I said, "When are you having yours, Jack?" He said, "The same day as yours, on the 18th of December or whatever it was." I said, "Thanks, Jack." So from that point of view, I organised my campaign without having to worry McMahon anymore.
Ladies and gentlemen, to present his policy speech for the forthcoming federal election, here is the Right Honourable William McMahon, Prime Minister of Australia.
Good evening. Tonight, as Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party, I want to talk to you about the issues on which we will fight this election. Basically, it is an election about policies. Policies that will directly affect you and your families for many, many years to come. And they will be years of changing values and expanding opportunities, especially for the young.
It was a hopeless campaign. There was no display of robust philosophic endeavour or conviction. Now, you can't get this from the members of a political party. The leader must be able to portray it.
Cabinet weren't supporting him, and he was fighting a one-man battle at the end of the election, well, most of the election.
Perhaps the final blow was when the Sydney Telegraph and its new owner, Rupert Murdoch, advocated a vote for Labor.
The ABC's Canberra news editor, Jack Commons, says the government has been defeated. Party officials of the Liberal Party and the ALP conceded this a few minutes ago.
The Labor Party won an 11-seat majority.
The remarkable thing about the 72 election was not that the Labor Party won. Everybody expected them to. The remarkable thing was that McMahon, leading a broken government, came so close to survival.
Sir Robert Menzies had kept the Liberals in power for 17 years. Just 6 years after his retirement, even he was losing the faith.
I was surprised one day when he said to me, and I think it must have been after the 1972 election, that he had not voted for the Liberal Party in the last 2 elections. I was amazed. And so, with some diffidence, I said, "Well, what did you do? Did you vote informal?" "No." "Well, who did you vote for?" He said, "I voted DLP."
From its record majority in 1966, the Liberal Party had decayed with alarming speed. William McMahon went back to Canberra to tender his resignation, and Liberal ministers began to clean out their offices.
Nobody knew what to do. I mean, you'll laugh at this. There were 5 ministers who had to go and buy a motor car. They didn't even have a motor car in the family. There were ex-ministers who didn't know how to dial a telephone. The gods had been thrown out of heaven, and there they were, no longer with walking behind the big chief, you know, with the sunshades over them and some little boy at the end of the session with a switch keeping the blowflies off their backside. It all disappeared. Nobody wanted to talk to them. They were totally unimportant, and they couldn't cope.
Well, thanks a lot. It's been a good night so far.
You must be careful not to become defensive, not to become too explanatory.
You know, nobody's made any mistakes. They haven't fluffed their lines. They haven't got things the wrong way round.
I confidently believe that we of the Liberal Party are going on to greater strength in the years ahead.
And this, you can get into trouble doing this. I'm not talking about myself.
We should now look at all our problems in an attitude of generosity of mind and should not have bitterness or recriminations coming into our future actions.
Gracie Fields was sang in much the same way, and she had a song which said, "Wish me luck as you kiss me goodbye." Well, that's not my theme song. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm not say good night, but not goodbye. But wish me luck.